Hi. Very interesting to hear people speak before me and about the commonalities we all have in place, especially this notion of providence, place and family history, which is very much about my talk today. It's the presentation really is kind of rooted in my personal history. And as Roisin mentioned and earlier on Susan mentioned, I was born in Stoke-on-Trent, worked in the ceramics industry, and one of the reasons for my kind of involvement in ceramics goes back to place and family ties. Stoke-on-Trent, I'd probably say, still is the centre of ceramic production in the UK. The physicality of the landscape bears hundreds and hundreds of years of industrial activity. Like most industrial places, centres, they're not pretty places to live. The landscape has been moulded by kind of hundreds of years of mining. In fact, the image there on your left-hand side is a shot from the early 1990s of another key industry in Stoke, which was steel production, which sadly no longer exists. The hills there in the background are slag heaps from the coal mining industry. So this kind of morphing of a place as, you know, someone who's grown up in Stoke, all well, very familiar with this kind of ugliness of the city, but also this kind of soul of community. My grandmother there, again on the far right-hand side, worked in the ceramics industry throughout most of her life, like most families did. To give you an indication of the peak of the ceramics industry, 79,000 people were employed in 1948. Today, there's less than 6,000. From her activity being involved in numerous skilled and semi-skilled jobs in the factory, she would amass this kind of range of wares from the period in the 1930s, 1940s, and then these things would be situated in a china cabinet. So as a child being exposed to all these kind of what were basically novelty wares and brightly coloured kind of knickknacks, that was my kind of first real exposure to ceramics. Also the kind of knowledge of processes, fettling, sponging, firing, placing, commonplace language in those households. So pretty much inevitable. Sorry, I'm trying to get it to move forward. No. Sorry. Pretty much inevitable that I would follow a similar path. So I'd left school at 16, was apprenticed at the Wedgwood factory with a group of largely male workforce, because again, you're probably all aware of the gender separation in big industries. The men did the manual work, the heavy lifting, the kind of female contingency did the decorating, etc. So most of these skills I picked up at that point in 1987 were all handcraft skills. So we would turn plaster on a lathe or on a whirler, or we would model things in clay, which then would be kind of moulded and then passed on to the next division in the factory. But what was great at that point in time was, like I mentioned earlier, the sense of camaraderie, working with your friend sitting next to you, the banter, not very politically correct, I must add, but it was a great time. Very fond memories of the place. Also, just amassing those range of skills. No one was there to instruct you, you just watched by. You learn through watching people make things, make mistakes, and you would gradually pick up this kind of knowledge base. So the image there is some of the objects I made during the end of my training, 16, 17, at Wedgwoods. And again, this thing about providence. The image here is a photograph from 1859. The guy sitting in the centre there is Josiah Wedgwood's grandson, Francis Wedgwood. And someone who was tracing the Brownsword family tree asked me what I did. I told them what I did, and they sent me this wonderful image of a group of Etruria workers, and they'd served an average of 54 and a half years service at Wedgwood. The guy sitting here is Moses Brownsword, someone again from my lineage. There was two of them, Aaron and Moses. Aaron is my direct descendant and Moses was his brother. He's a gilder in the line of there. So again, this kind of fascination for place and kind of history keeps on cropping up in the work, as you'll see. So I was very much encouraged by the group of people I worked with who'd been there like me as an apprentice and stayed 20, 30 years doing the same thing. Brilliant at what they did, but no kind of ambition to take it further. Again, it was very much seen as a job. People just, came to work 8 in the morning, finished at 5, and then went home. But they were instrumental in me to go, to kind of move forward to college. So they kind of said, don't end up like us, miserable sod, go and do something with your life. So I went to study at Cardiff, did my undergraduate there, went on to the Royal College of Art in the early mid-90s. And the work I was making at that point of time would draw upon this kind of history of production and skills. And I saw the work really as a vehicle for social commentary. So it drew heavily upon these kind of this genre of political figurines from the early 1800s, which you'll see there on the far left-hand side. But I was, again, I grew up with this kind of genre of social documentary plays and kind of films by the likes of Ken Loach and Alan Bleasdale, Alan Clark. And I kind of had this, I'd moved back to Stoke as well by that point and kind of hung around with the guys on the factory. And it was like no time had passed. You were still there, very much with them. And this cycle of kind of, the daily grind and then the wage packet on the Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, out on the town, blowing what they'd earned, and this kind of hedonism which came with it, really. So this body of work was really a kind of reflection of that feeling trapped, but also this kind of release. So the kind of objects were made from this history of redundant moulds, which I'd kind of gathered and asked and borrowed. And so I was kind of physically tapping into that kind of history of production. So these are moulds from the Gladstone Pottery Museum, which I was allowed to use to kind of construct some of these objects with. But at one point in time, I'd kind of had success with showing the work in the UK and internationally, but I'd felt that I was kind of, again, on this kind of production line. And I really wanted a point of evaluation, so I'd applied for a period of artist in residency at the European Ceramic Work Centre in Holland, which is this wonderful kind of utopian idea that anyone from any discipline, creative discipline, can go and work for a period of 3 months and explore clay without actually physically making anything at the end of it. So again, another unique model which we could all kind of embrace and use in a kind of this post-industrial setting. So it allowed me to kind of explore the material again. One of the things I wanted to do was try and escape narrative, but it didn't happen because 3 weeks into the residency, I returned back to Stoke. Met with a friend who was re-employed in the booming demolition industry in Stoke, and he was knocking down this wonderful kind of 19th century factory there on the left-hand side. And I kind of, just the kind of realization of what was going and seeing this kind of physical demolition of something like that really kind of prompted me to go round the place, the 6 towns, and record what was left. And also what was left, but nothing was being done to preserve the cultural heritage of the place. I mean, the building there on the right-hand side is a Grade 2 listed factory, but there was kind of no kind of investment in restoring these places. I think there's probably about 40 bottle ovens left in the area, which again are unique pieces of industrial architecture out of, at one time, over 2,000 kind of ovens. It's also got me looking at the human element of industrialization. Again, industrialization brought about standardization of the object, the elimination of the hand. You know, any kind of evidence of human contact was considered a flaw. But what I was looking at really was the kind of byproducts of production, these things which you could see human labor intact. So a fingerprint from 200 years ago, left in one of these saggers, which were then placed in the kiln, or a kind of prop which had been pinched by hand. So again, this kind of notion of some identity of the anonymous labor which made these brands what they are today, you know. I think what we do is fail to acknowledge that the kind of mugs what we drink out of, maybe not now because they're probably all kind of mechanized production, had passed through nearly 25, 30 people's hands to get there. So it was really kind of citing that kind of hidden knowledge within the work and trying to bring that to light with the things I was making, alongside the kind of physical kind of erasure of these once prevalent sites of manufacture. So the work I was making at the time was citing this kind of heritage, but also the kind of reduction of this heritage. I was also looking at archaeology. The Potteries Museum in Stoke has got this wonderful collection of industrial archaeology, which is expansive, and not a lot of it is on physical display, but I got access to the archives and was digging out some of these objects which were kind of testimonies of kind of human knowledge and tenacity to make things succeed. So the image there, what you see on the left-hand side, is a soft-paste porcelain teapot from the 1750s, which again, if any of you know what soft-paste porcelain is, it's basically a crude mix of china clay and glass frit, which when fired in a bottle oven, you've got the extremities of heat to kind of control, and you would often get a huge loss rate. So this kind of melting, this molten quality of this object, which I kind of loved, it just showed the lengths these people would go to perfect these objects. I mean, the factory only lasted in reality for 10 years, but I just think they're kind of wonderful pieces of work. And I was citing these objects through my own kind of making, so kind of making things which looked like they'd been misshapen and deformed in the kiln. Also, this physical archaeology of the place. If you can imagine, by 1800, Stoke had paralleled China in terms of its physical ceramic output. And with ceramic production being such a kind of vastly, well, at that point in time, there was a lot of loss within the production. There'd got to be places to put that loss, so the whole foundations of the city, wherever there's a hole dug, you will see some ceramic fragments there. So I was very much drawing upon this notion of archaeology as a kind of metaphor for the place, really, because the industry was becoming almost a kind of, you know, a remnant of something glorious. And taking these kind of taxonomies, these systems of display, and very much appropriating these for the fragments I was making. So this is a piece of work called Transition from 1999. I also mentioned this spent ceramic material, which is known in the trade as Ashraf. And the house we live in Stoke is actually, you know, this material is used as foundations, hardcore for kind of fill for houses. At the back of the house, I was doing some DIY and digging a hole and digging this stuff up. And the hole was getting deeper and deeper. And the DIY was not really getting done. Anyone who comes to the house can still see that it's in progress. But I was taking this redundant material and then refiring it with the things I was making, so it's this kind of regenerative process, giving this kind of stuff, a new lease of life. And there's a wonderful piece of accidental sculpture in the Potteries Museum, which now is on public display. It's 3 blackware teapots there, which are fused into a saga. And my kind of response to it, which is a bone china plate fluxed onto a kiln shelf with a piece of Archaeology fixed to the side. It's called Remnant. Again, another project I was in Residency I was involved with at the International Ceramic Research Centre in Denmark. Again, I'd been commissioned by Shrewsbury Museum and Art Gallery to respond creatively to their collection of Coalport and Coalbrookdale porcelain, which when I kind of saw what it was, I was immediately repelled and kind of, but also equally fascinated by the extent of craft embedded within these objects. So my response was really to kind of zoom in within these kind of very Baroque, Rococo details, and in a very perverse way subvert the crafting of them. Having gone through this system of kind of conditioned skill, which again you'll hear me talk about it, I've got a kind of immense respect for the skills on the factory, but also a lot of my work, having gone through that system, is about kind of a kind of subversion and a reaction to it. So there's this kind of paradox throughout. So I was looking at materials like fabric and cardboard, which would then take these elements and re-describe them in a different way. So this is an element which you will see in the piece which is on display here in Kilkenny. And also in reaction to the kind of heavily laboured porcelain, using the wood ash of the kiln to decorate some of the pieces. This is in Denmark again, Skalskor. And the triptych called Series, which again is a deconstruction of the objects which I was working from. And Series was simply the museum accession code I'd kind of stolen. This then brings me to the kind of work I was doing for the PhD during this kind of period of time. Again, I'd always wanted this ambition to return to the factory in some capacity, and the PhD was one excuse to do that. I returned back to Wedgwood in 2003, very much kind of, it was very much an emotive incentive really to go back there, because I was aware that this kind of huge reduction in the workforce and these kind of skills being replaced by technology. And I went there initially for 3 months, but ended up spending 8 months on the factory, just me following, shadowing people with a camcorder in a very low-tech way. But I felt it really important to get down their kind of oral testimony before they were going to be booted out the door by the accountancy. So I started filming where I was an apprentice back in the modelling studio, and out of a studio of 20 guys, there was 7 people left. And one of the people who I had the privilege to film was someone who trained me, or helped to train me, who was reluctant to embrace computer technology, and that was one of the reasons why he was going. He saw kind of making as a sensual act, and the use of the hand and kind of materials as being very much part of the design process. So I followed him making this wonderful kind of reproduction of an 18th century source boat. And it was so wonderful to kind of watch his hands caress this piece of plaster. Incredible. I also filmed some of the technology which was replacing these skills. And again, I went to Wedgwood's last week and found out that the technology has since been shipped to China. So that just shows how bad it's going. Having worked on the factory, I was very much... Oops, I jumped on that. Having worked on the factory, I was very aware of its, again, history. 1759, Wedgwood started in its archive. So this is, again, a mould from the 1780s. which I dug out of the archive, and then I think it was only because I'd had insider knowledge of the place and the processes and the people, they let me work with this stuff. I kind of made a mould of these objects and then kind of subsequently slipcast within them. Also, oops, going back again. By filming some of these craft skills, I was filming mainly the hand and then trying to tease out questions and kind of oral history from some of these workers who spoke brilliantly. You know, part of the reason for doing it was what existed was some kind of silent historical black and white footage or some promotional footage with someone with long fingernails painting a plate. You know, it was completely devoid of the maker's voice. And one of the kind of key things with doing this filming was to try and tease out this kind of knowledge of materials and what they did and who trained these people as some kind of archive. So when they would make whatever they were making, this is someone setting up a mould. It's making a clay raft. When they poured the plaster on and discarded the kind of clay, I would be then scavenging the remnants out of the bins, which would then taking it away and firing them to preserve this kind of knowledge, this hidden knowledge. So this led to a piece of work called Salvage Series, which you can see a detail of there. And then, again, just going around different areas of the factory, there was a massive reduction while I was there actually doing the filming. The Wedgwood group had just announced 1,000 people to lose their job. So it was a very sensitive time. I was quite lucky really to be in there at that point in time. And I didn't really let my agendas be known publicly. But I also had to respect the confidentiality of workers, and you can imagine the commentary was very raw. And with me just sitting with a camcorder, I got most of it on film, but I couldn't use it publicly. But this was the Coalport casters who had been, you know, their apprenticeship was a 6-year apprenticeship. They'd since bought in these German casting machines, these Lippert casting machines. Then 2/3 of the workforce was made redundant. And then the last remaining the last remaining casters were then re-employed, just emptying these moulds at the bottom of a conveyor belt, after taking as well another 1/3 reduction in pay for doing that. But these scraps were very much kind of symbols of the people, really. And again, I was collecting these kind of remnants from that stage of production, wetting them down and firing them in the kiln, which would then be part of the installations. This was the kind of exhibition which was called Collage in History at the Potteries Museum, which I showed my 3 kind of bodies of work, but also a lot of the archaeology I'd drawn inspiration from, which were very much this kind of tacit knowledge embedded within it. I also showed the films which are on, they're being shown now at the museum, so please go and have a look, which again show this high craftsmanship of some of these very traditional skills. And again, a lot of the people in those films from 2003 are no longer employed in that factory now. But alongside it, I was doing a parallel bit of research, which was filming the demolition of these kind of factories. So it's this kind of simple relationship of creation and destruction. And this is the installation Salvage Series with the films. This is at Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. In 2009, it was a show called Possibilities and Losses. And again, I'd always wanted to go to China because of the displacement of labour from Stoke, from North Staffordshire. I didn't really get to the places where the labour had gone to, but I went to another place, which was an hour away from where the Terracotta Army is, in Xi'an, which was a Fuli International Ceramic Museum. Again, this area of China has got its kind of heritage of producing Han and Tang dynasty ceramics, and kind of cashed in on this kind of, the reproducing these Tang dynasty finials. But I went there with an idea of, I was very much interested in this global cycle of knowledge and how it kind of passes round, gets recycled. So I was looking at early porcelain production from Britain in the 1750s. But again, how technologies develop and how things happen. And basically, a lot of these kind of ideas of early porcelain production, the kind of mix of materials, very crude in their early forms. People were mixing things like gypsum and china clay together. Gypsum almost, you probably know it more familiar as being plaster. So I was kind of experimenting with mixing glass frits and kind of plaster and clay together to make these kind of these new bodies. So I did a lot of kind of material-based research, but then when I got to China, they hadn't got the same materials, so it's kind of naivety on my part, really. So I started, again, just filming indigenous labour. And the conditions on the factory, I can only compare them to what I think they would have been like at Stoke in the mid-1800s. There was no health and safety. People kind of hadn't even got chairs to work, sit and work with. They were sitting on the floor and making things. But very kind of high craft skill. And I was looking at tools of labour. So this wonderful kind of mould maker's bucket was then, I'd taken a mould from it and then press moulded it in porcelain, again to kind of give porcelain obviously having its kind of elitist connotations. And then glazed it with these Tang dynasty glazes, which were all red lead oxide, which was kind of abundant on the factory. So people mixing this stuff by hand, people dipping these objects into these kind of lead glazes by hand. But it really got me thinking about, okay, we might get something cheaper at this end, but to what cost? The only good thing about lead oxide is you can see where it is. These paths of orange completely all the way through the factory. And there's this wave of kind of Europeans going over to China to kind of cash in on this cheap labour to make things and then bring it back to Europe and sell it for a huge amount of money, which I completely abhor. And it was really important for me that I didn't kind of exploit anyone when I was there, which a lot of people did, really. And one of the notions, what part of the interpretation was when I was in China was, again, trying to cite this kind of historical plagiarism. Stoke was founded on kind of plagiarism from China. Its kind of industry was based on thieving from the Chinese. And this is a piece of Staffordshire chinoiserie from about the kind of mid-1700s. And this is something which was made on the factory at Fuli. And I started to kind of copy it. So this kind of system of stealing something, but then kind of making it in a very crude fashion. So it's kind of citing this kind of cultural theft. Which when I interviewed everyone on the factory in Stoke, it was like, oh, these bloody Chinese nicking our jobs and all this stuff, They weren't aware of our history. So I was copying these dogs of faux and these kind of terracotta, these kind of Tang dynasty figures, but making them in this kind of cack-handed way, I suppose. Also, this kind of element of archaeology which crops up in the work. This is the ceramic graveyard at Fuli, this wonderful kind of tile mural which was abandoned there in the factory. And when you turned it around, this exquisite craftsmanship there. So I just rebuilt it in the space the way I found it, really. So it's this kind of paradox of high craft, but hidden by this kind of nonchalant stacking of these kind of objects. It's a piece called Phoenix. And the piece here, which you saw earlier, called Tomb. And back to Stoke-on-Trent. This is a kind of daily kind of site, really. This is the Royal Dalton factory, which was demolished in 2009-10, which I filmed one day a week. A bit like Ground Zero. But part of Stoke's problem has been never embracing the future. It's always relied on this kind of, it's again run by marketing rather than design. No real risk-taking to kind of move on the products forward. And it was the death nail for a lot of companies, as well as kind of people coming in from other industries, managers coming in from other industries, thinking that they knew about how to manage a factory making ceramics and really making the wrong decisions when they wouldn't listen to the workers from the ground floor upwards who knew everything how the factory worked. So the kind of wastage, which I'm sure, again, people are familiar with, it was kind of a bit obscene, really, and the workers suffered as a result of it. And I, with a project with the British Ceramic Biennial, I was very much interested upon the reasoning why the industry originated from Stoke. And I kind of curated a project which is called Marlhole, which goes back to Stoke pre-industry. And again, it's origins of naturally occurring clay and also coal, long flame coal for firing. And also the origins of the industry are very much embedded upon this kind of transference of knowledge from silver. 2 Dutch silversmiths came over to Stoke, well, Newcastle-under-Lyme, which is the area I grew up in, and tried to emulate these Yixing teapots which were flooding Europe during that period of time. They applied silversmithing techniques to ceramics, brought about this wonderful kind of refinement of making. They were amongst the first to kind of use liquid clay into moulds and then use a lathe to turn these things. And the clay there, at the you can see on the left-hand side, is a shot of the seam of clay, which is at the back of my parents' house in Bradwell Wood. These wonderful kind of plastic surface outcrops of material. And again, the geology of the place, this kind of, this material known as a Etruria marl, which is something I got a group of artists, European artists, to come to North Staffordshire because I was very much interested in this notion of regenerating the creative potential of Stoke and kind of getting people in with a different perspective to kind of tap into that and do something different with its heritage. So we worked in these I located a quarry in North Staffordshire which was still active, and it's one of the largest quarries in Europe for brick making. And one of my ideas was to kind of disable the people who'd come over and work in the quarry of their skills, take away that kind of sophistication of their kind of skilled knowledge, and put them in an environment like this, which is an abundance of material, but also see what happened during a period of 5 days. So we had a wheelbarrow and a shovel and a bucket. And it was very much driven by this quote by Paul Feyerabend, which was about kind of knowledge acquisition and about failure being very much part of how we kind of extend our knowledge. So it was the concept was very much driven by that. And these were the artists when they arrived, who I thought they were all going to go home after the first day. But it was about this responding to sight and about embracing the kind of history of place and the reasoning why. I'm probably running massively over, aren't I? I'm sorry. So I was using the material very much as a kind of drawing and painting material, and also quick to cotton on that the tool, we could use whatever we found on site as a tool, and there just happened to be 3 JCB diggers which we quickly commandeered to kind of shift this huge volume of material around. This is Alexander Ingelfried, a Dutch artist who came and used her body to manipulate the material. These were her tools. And this is sorry, I'm going to have to speed through this because I'm sure you're all dying to get your lunch. This is Torbjörn Kvasbo, who again created this almost Robert Smithson glue pour piece using this Etruria marl. And a kind of Finnish designer called Pekka Pekari, who was taking these kind of semi-redundant ceramic terms, counted all the letters within them, and then deposited them within this 25 metre by 25 metre space within the quarry. I'm going to cut my talk a bit short because I wanted to show you this clip of footage. Is that okay with everyone? Yeah? I'm probably rabbiting on too much. Can someone just help me just click off this? I just wanted to show you a piece of footage from this marl hole film.
What are you looking for?
I just need to get out to get back into the desktop. That's it. Okay. And Johnny McGee, who's the filmmaker, who's head of film at Manchester Metropolitan University, had shot the film in the style of a Western, because when he'd come to the site, that was his creative response. So it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, so you get this very dramatic kind of music. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it if you are interested. Okay.
Sorry, no.
Okay.
Sorry.
But part of the remit, anyway, the point I was going to make was that my agenda is to bring in people to Stoke and see what potential it still has as a creative centre, and really use that as a kind of point of regeneration. And in September, I've got a contingency of 27 Norwegians coming to the Spode factory in Stoke to run a site-specific project there. I'll let you watch the trailer anyway.